These borders were not drawn until the 20th century. This is Central Asia, made up of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Since 1991, when the 5 states officially became independent countries, they have had the opportunity to establish their own unique identities. So how did this historically important center of trade and civilization develop into the Central Asia we know today? And what has China got to do with its revival? Central Asia was a crucial part of the Silk Road, an old trade route linking China with the Middle East and Imperial Rome.
Connections have existed across Eurasia, of course, since the beginning. We really tend to pinpoint the origins in the Bronze Age, when luxury items are traded across distances, say, between Central Asia and South Asia, in around about 3000 to 2000 BCE.
Epic mountains, huge deserts, and vast open plains of grassland make up this region.
People imagine that it's very, very well connected. In reality, it's anything but connected, because the landscapes of Central Asia comprise some of the highest mountains in the world. There are some very long rivers, but they're largely unnavigable. When we see Central Asian traders coming into their own in the middle of the first millennium CE, what they're really doing is they're becoming experts in traversing this very difficult landscape. And in doing so, these goods become exotic, they become expensive, difficult to find, and that makes the regions of Central Asia very wealthy from that produce.
Besides being at the heart of trade routes, Central Asia was also home to much intellectual innovation.
Scholars are moving from city to exchange knowledge, and these cities themselves become repositories of learning, and there are colleges founded in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, so they effectively become like the Oxford and Cambridge of Central Asia at the time.
Great scholars and scientists like Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, and Avicenna, whose writings on medicine and healing were used in Europe for hundreds of years, were born here. Historic empires left an indelible mark on the land and people, including the Mongols under Genghis Khan, and the strong nomadic horseback traditions continue to this day.
I suppose one of the unintended consequences of viewing the Silk Roads from either end, be it China or Rome, is that the area in between often gets characterized as somewhere that was influenced from outside. And I think really that Central Asia was actually a driver of this change. It was Central Asians doing the trade. It was those people with the expertise and the knowledge to actually harness all of the resources around them that actually started to connect Eurasia together.
However, Central Asia's significance began to decline in the 15th and 16th centuries as European explorers discovered maritime routes, reducing the Silk Road's prominence. By the 19th century, the region then became the arena for the power struggle between the British and the Russian empires, making way for a new chapter in its history.
Well, the colonization of Central Asia took a very long time. It was a very tedious and challenging and complicated process for Russian Empire because the region was fighting viciously against the colonization. It actually took Russia more than 2 centuries to do so, and it turned into a slow process of land grabbing in a way.
Political influence was brought from Russia as military officials arrived to govern Central Asia.
So in the aftermath of conquest, the Russians introduce a form of colonial rule that very much resembles what you might see in the British or French empires. They change the territorial structure of the region. They start to construct railways through the region. From the 1890s, you start to see the commercial cultivation of cotton becoming increasingly important economically.
In 1917, the Russian Revolution led to the empire collapsing and the Soviet Union took its place, thus beginning the most radical reshaping of Central Asia in its history by creating new borders.
So the borders of Central Asia were never intended to be the borders of international states. They were intended to be the borders of republics within the Soviet Union. And actually, as through the course of the Soviet experience, those borders were at times moved, they were renegotiated, they were readjusted, and sometimes they ran literally through the middle of somebody's backyard.
The states underwent massive phases of modernization and industrialization. Nomadic communities were forced to move to cities to work, in a process known as sedentarization.
There's a terrible famine. Something like 40% of the ethnic Kazakh population, that's 1.5 million people, dies of a combination of starvation and disease. And the nomadic economy is completely destroyed, not least because 90% of all the animals in the Kazakh Soviet Republic also die. So at that point, a nomadic lifestyle is no longer possible. So Kazakh culture and civilization, in a way, has to be rebuilt from scratch under Soviet rule, and it's a very traumatic process.
The Soviet industrial project was also responsible for one of the greatest man-made ecological disasters of the 20th century.
The Soviet Union was a very developmentalist state, and the most notorious example of this in Central Asia is the destruction of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea is destroyed because of the construction of the Karakum Canal and is designed to boost cotton production.
Once one of the largest lakes in the world, the Aral Sea has been shrinking since the 1960s and is now less than 10% of its original size and is largely a desert.
The thing to note is that the drying up of the Aral Sea was not a mistake. They knew it was going to happen.
The water scarcity has led to an increase of windborne toxic dust that can cause a range of health issues for people living around the area. But there were also some positive aspects to colonial rule in Central Asia.
Thanks to measures taken by the Soviet Union, these simple folk are being taught to read.
So what the Soviet regime did introduce was much better healthcare and much better education than had existed in the Tsarist period, or indeed in the pre-colonial period. So by the 1950s, you have more or less universal literacy in local languages.
By the end of the 20th century, the Berlin Wall came down, and in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, creating these 5 new independent countries in a space where borders hadn't existed before.
These republics, as they were constituted and the borders drawn throughout the 1920s and 1930s in this process of delimitation, they were notionally drawn as ethno-national republics. But actually, the experience of Soviet kind of developmentalism meant that populations were moved, populations changed, populations grew, and by 1991, the populations were very ethnically diverse.
These artificial borders were created by the Soviet Union. But the barbed wire appeared after it collapsed. It split the newly independent states, which wouldn't give up a single inch of their land. This is the result. Half of this street is in Uzbekistan, another half is in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, so sometimes these borders don't necessarily fit with their own lived experience of where they would be traveling to visit friends, or where they would be going trading and so forth. So sometimes people had the experience of becoming citizens of a nation state that wasn't necessarily theirs.
These countries were now free to chart their own futures. But this new post-Soviet world brought its own challenges and the struggle to find their place in the global order.
They built heavily and were influenced heavily by the blueprint that they had from the Soviet time and from the ideological machine that the Soviet power created. Because they couldn't reinvent themselves overnight. It took a very long process to rebuild these nations, to construct new ideologies.
What's clear is that over the decades, they've all forged unique identities within their own borders.
Oh my God, the stance. That's how a lot of discourses are usually calling these 5 states. But I think they're very, very different in what it stands for. And actually, the stance as a term, as a concept, really is very, very hurtful for the region, for the people, precisely because we're not the same.
While the states have focused on building their nations from within, they have also been subject to external influences.
Russia still exerts significant political influence in Central Asia. It takes slightly different forms in different states.
Other countries are taking the opportunity to muscle in on Central Asia.
I think with the collapse of Soviet Union, Turkey became a lot more present in the region.
Turkey shares a lot of cultural, historical, religious and even linguistic heritage with Central Asia.
It's very present in construction. It was for a very long time present in educational infrastructure as well. People love traveling to Turkey. Migration is a big aspect as well. So I think Turkey is one of those overlooked partners and influences in Central Asia, but nevertheless a very strong one.
Central Asia has also served as a re-export hub of goods into Russia, which has increased ties with the region's other superpower neighbor to its east.
From a sort of a Central Asian perspective, there is this acute awareness of the size and power of China, but also the important role that China plays, for instance, as an investor in the region. There's a lot of Chinese investment in road construction, in opening new railway lines and so forth. And I think that impact on their capacity to be overtly critical of the way that Muslim communities in China have been treated.
In northwestern China lies Xinjiang, historically known as East Turkestan, a desert province with a significant population of ethnic groups that are mostly Muslim and of Turkic descent with close cultural and historical ties to Central Asia.
Every time we speak about Central Asia locally, we actually include all of these spaces because we share so much culturally with East Turkestan, with Urumqi, with Kashgar.
There are about 12 million Uyghurs, mostly Muslim, living in Xinjiang. China has been accused of committing crimes against humanity and possibly genocide against them. This includes the use of so-called re-education camps to eradicate Uyghur identity and culture. China denies any human rights abuses. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, an immense global infrastructure development strategy, China transforms the physical landscape of Central Asia and massively improves roads and railways to establish the region as a trade hub, much like its Silk Road days.
The fact that the Chinese leader came to Kazakhstan to announce the One Belt, One Road initiative is a big sign of how symbolically important he thinks Central Asia is to this specific project. To build a very ambitious infrastructural project like that requires a lot of lobbying and a lot of negotiations in the region. You cannot just sign one agreement with all the 5 stands.
Though that's not to say Central Asia lacks agency on the geopolitical stage.
The way Central Asia is usually portrayed is that it's stuck between the Russian bear and Chinese dragon. And it's often portrayed like that in foreign media specifically, because it's easier to explain things like that. I think Central Asia is the type of region that can influence itself from within. There's so much to offer. We have a very rich history. We have a very vibrant kind of developments right now, contemporary developments. When people are thinking that there's Central Asia remains this unknown space on the map, they're often forgetting that such ancient places like Samarkand and Bukhara are as ancient and interesting as Rome, for example. China is very influential in the region right now, so is Russia. But it doesn't really mean that the region is passively accepting this influence and is not intervening back in this relationship both between China and Central Asia and between Russia and Central Asia.
The Central Asian states have the opportunity to be the masters of their own fate as their position at the crossroads of the world becomes more significant. Whether China's Belt and Road Initiative fully revives the ancient Silk Road and the region's historic prominence, however, remains to be seen.